Welcome to Moonlit Insomniac, the place where wandering stories gently carry you into rest. Through the sunlit courtyards of Granada, imagine warm sunlight spilling across patterned tiles, the cool breath of shaded archways, and the steady murmur of fountains that never rush, only whisper. As you listen, you may feel your own thoughts soften, your body loosen, and a quiet invitation arise to let go, to drift, to be carried. Stay with this story and allow its gentle rhythm to untangle the day and guide you, step by step, into the peace of sleep. Chapter 1. The Courtyard Gate. The day began with quiet promise. Eleanor pushed open the heavy wooden gate that led into the first courtyard, its surface sun-warmed and marked by centuries of hands before hers. The hinges groaned softly, a sound that seemed less mechanical than alive, like an old friend sighing at being disturbed from rest. Beyond the threshold, the air shifted. It was cooler here, even though the sun glowed high above Granada. The courtyard gathered shade in its embrace, letting sunlight slip gently across patterned tiles rather than blaze against them. A fountain stood at the center, its voice steady and calming, water trickling in endless circles. The sound filled the space with a rhythm both ancient and soothing, like a heartbeat too slow to ever hurry. Eleanor stepped inside. The courtyard stretched wide, enclosed by walls painted in faded hues of terracotta and ivory. Arches opened like doorways to hidden rooms, their shapes carved with patience long ago. Climbing vines trailed across them, their leaves bright and alive, catching small pieces of sun as though wearing them as jewelry. She paused beneath an orange tree, its branches heavy with fruit. The scent drifted down, not sharp, but sweet and steady, mixing with the faint perfume of jasmine that grew along the far wall. When she reached for one of the oranges, her fingers brushed the glossy skin, still warm from the morning light. She didn't pick it. Instead, she let her hand fall back to her side, simply breathing in the fragrance, as though that alone nourished her. The tiles beneath her feet shimmered faintly where sunlight fell upon them. Patterns of blue and green swirled together, forming shapes that hinted at flowers and stars. With each step, Elena felt as though she were walking deeper into a dream painted onto stone. She lowered herself onto the fountain's edge, dipping her fingertips into the cool water. The sensation surprised her, a sudden contrast to the warmth of the day, and she drew in a long, easy breath. The water circled endlessly, never hurried, never spent. She found herself imagining how many had sat here before her, centuries of footsteps and voices, each carried away by the same gentle sound of water. A dove fluttered down, landing on the fountain rim not far from her hand. Its feathers caught the sun in soft shades of cream and grey, its head tilting as though curious about her presence. Elena smiled, whispering a greeting though she knew no words were needed. The bird dipped its beak into the water, drank, and then flew upward, leaving only the faintest ripple in its wake. The courtyard returned to stillness. Elena rose, her footsteps slow, unhurried. She followed the curve of the wall to a narrow archway, half hidden behind the vines. Beyond it, another courtyard waited, promising its own secrets. She hesitated for only a moment, her hand brushing the stone of the arch, cool to the touch, before stepping through. The second courtyard was smaller, quieter. Here the tiles were shaded, their colors richer for the lack of direct sun. A bench stood beneath a fig tree, its leaves casting dappled shadows across the ground. The air smelled faintly of honey, though she could not see its source. She sat, letting her eyes wander upward. Through the branches she could see only fragments of the sky, patches of soft blue framed by green. A breeze moved gently, stirring both leaf and shadow, as though the courtyard itself were breathing with her. From somewhere unseen, a guitar string sounded, just one note, soft, lingering, like the memory of music rather than music itself. Elena stilled, listening. The sound did not return, yet the silence it left behind felt fuller, richer, as though the notes still lingered in the air. She leaned back against the bench, closing her eyes. The air was warm but never heavy, the scent of fig leaves wrapping her like a light blanket. She let her breath slow, matching the rhythm of the fountain she had left behind. Her thoughts did not race here. They wandered like the breeze, soft, curious, without urgency. Images drifted, sunlight on water, the tilt of the dove's head, the orange glowing on its branch. Each detail felt like a treasure uncovered, small but radiant. When she opened her eyes again, she noticed a doorway across the courtyard. The wood was carved, delicate patterns etched into its surface like lace turned to stone. She felt drawn to it, though she knew not why. Rising slowly, she crossed the tiled floor, each step echoing faintly. Her hand touched the door. The carvings were smooth beneath her palm, worn by time. She pushed gently, and the door opened without resistance, as though it had been waiting for her. Beyond was a passageway dimly lit, its floor cool stone, its ceiling arched and narrow. The air here was cooler still, carrying the faint sound of water flowing somewhere deeper inside. Elena stepped forward, the door closing softly behind her. The passage led her to yet another courtyard, and this one took her breath. It was wide and filled with light, the fountain at its center far larger, its waters cascading from tier to tier in a melody of flowing sound. Around it, roses bloomed in every shade of pink and red, their petals soft as whispers, their fragrance filling the air like a gentle song. Elena stood at the edge, letting her gaze travel slowly across the scene. The sunlight here was brighter, yet still softened by the high walls, creating a space that felt timeless, neither bound by morning nor afternoon, simply bathed in an eternal glow. A group of swallows swooped above, their wings catching flashes of light as they circled the courtyard. Their movement was playful, effortless, as though the air itself had become their game. She watched them for a long while, her heart easing with each arc they traced. She moved closer to the fountain, sitting once more upon its edge. The spray touched her skin in fine droplets, cool and refreshing. She leaned forward, watching the water tumble endlessly from one level to the next. Her reflection shimmered in the pool, not steady but broken by ripples. She traced her hand across the surface, distorting the image further, until it was no longer herself she saw, but patterns of light and movement. She smiled softly, letting the water slip through her fingers. As she sat there, she realized she was no longer measuring time. The courtyards unfolded one after another, each with its own gifts, each inviting her deeper into stillness. There was no urgency to leave, no destination beyond the next open arch. Elena felt with a kind of gentle certainty that the courtyards would carry her exactly where she needed to go. Chapter 2: The Courtyard of Faces. Elena lingered by the fountain longer than she had intended, her fingers drifting lazily through the cool water until the warmth of the sun on her shoulders nudged her onward. The courtyard, with its roses and cascading fountain, had settled into her bones, but curiosity stirred like a whisper inside her. She rose slowly, smoothing her dress, and followed the archway leading to another part of the old palace grounds. The stone beneath her sandals was worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, each one echoing faintly as she moved through the shaded passage. Ahead, she could hear voices, not loud but steady, blending with the sound of water and birdsong. She slowed, listening. When she stepped into the next courtyard, she paused. This one was larger, open to the sun, its center framed by a wide pool lined with tiles the color of the sky. Around its edges, people moved softly, almost dreamlike. Some sat on benches tucked beneath citrus trees. Others leaned near the pool, watching the water catch the sunlight and break it into 1,000 glimmering shards. Their movements were unhurried, as though the day itself had slowed within these walls. Elena took a place beneath the shade of a laurel tree and sat quietly, her eyes drawn not to the fountain this time, but to the people themselves. A boy chased a small wooden boat across the pool's edge. His laughter was quiet, more like a ripple than a shout, but it reached her clearly. His boat was simple, carved from a piece of driftwood, a scrap of cloth tied to a stick for its sail. Each time the breeze caught it, the boy's eyes widened with wonder as though the tiny vessel were bound for a distant sea. Elena smiled, remembering how she too had once believed small objects held vast adventures. Near him, a woman in a pale scarf bent to gather fallen blossoms from beneath a tree. She cupped each flower as though it were precious, placing them into a woven basket at her side. Her face was calm, her lips curved in a quiet smile, as if the task itself was a prayer. Elena watched the woman's hands, graceful, slow, tender, and thought how often the world overlooked such gestures. On a stone bench at the far end of the courtyard, two old men sat side by side. They were dressed simply, their shoulders slightly bent with age, but their eyes were bright. One leaned forward as he spoke, his hands sketching shapes in the air, while the other laughed, the sound low and warm. Their laughter blended with the trickle of water, a harmony so natural it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Elena felt a tug at her heart. The way they sat, close, comfortable, with no need for pretense, reminded her that companionship need not be grand to be profound. She shifted her gaze again. A girl of perhaps 12 knelt at the edge of the pool, trailing her fingers in the water. Her reflection shimmered, and she tilted her head, studying it as though she were searching for someone she might become. The girl's dark hair fell into her face, but she didn't brush it back. She seemed content to simply exist in that moment, half in the water, half in herself. Elena wondered if she too, when she was young, had ever gazed so intently into her own reflection, hoping to glimpse the future. The courtyard was alive, not with noise or bustle, but with stories unfolding in silence. Elena felt herself drifting into them, as though each person's quiet presence carried her deeper into the mystery of the place. She let her thoughts wander. The boy and his boat, perhaps he would grow into someone who still chased adventure, or perhaps the world would press him into routine. But for now, in this courtyard, he was free, his laughter a reminder that joy needed little more than wood, water, and wind. The woman with her basket of blossoms, Elena imagined her returning home later, laying the flowers out on a table, arranging them not for decoration, but as a way of listening to beauty. Maybe she lived alone, maybe with many. Either way, her calm presence suggested that the act itself was enough. The two old men, their laughter seemed to echo across the centuries, proof that even as bodies aged and days grew shorter, friendship could still hold a brightness stronger than time. The girl with the reflection. Elena thought of her own younger self, how she had once looked into fountains and puddles, imagining that her future self might one day step through the ripples and take her hand. She felt a softness in her chest as she watched the girl, a wish that she might always hold on to that curiosity. The air around her seemed to shimmer. Sunlight filtered through branches, scattering across tiles patterned with blues and whites. The scent of orange blossoms drifted in and out, like a melody too soft to catch in full. Elena leaned back against the laurel tree, her eyes half closing. She was not tired, yet a restful stillness spread through her as she listened to the courtyard breathe. People moved gently, like figures in a painting, each absorbed in their quiet rituals. From somewhere above, the swallows swooped again, darting across the sky in playful arcs. Their shadows brushed the pool, turning the reflections into fleeting shapes. The boy clapped, chasing their movements with his eyes. The old men looked up too, chuckling at the sudden show. The woman paused in her gathering, a blossom poised in her hand as she tilted her head skyward. For a moment, Eleanor felt that all of them, strangers sharing a courtyard, were bound by the same invisible thread, stitched together by sunlight, water, and breath. She stayed like that for a long while, not needing to move, content simply to watch. But eventually, curiosity stirred again. Her gaze shifted toward a small doorway carved into the far wall. Unlike the grand arches she had passed through before, this one was narrow, almost hidden by climbing ivy. She rose slowly, her hands brushing the folds of her dress, and began to walk toward it. As she moved past the pool, the boy glanced at her, his eyes bright with the innocence of someone who believes every passerby might be part of his story. Elena smiled at him, a silent exchange, and he grinned before turning back to his boat. The woman with the blossoms did not look up, but Elena felt as though the quiet joy of her task followed her onward. The two old men's laughter lingered in her ears like music, and the girl's reflection still shimmered in her memory. When she reached the doorway, Eleanor paused, her hand resting against the cool stone frame. She turned once more to look back at the courtyard, at its people, its pool, its quiet harmony. For a moment she felt she might stay forever, but the pull of the unknown was stronger. She slipped through the ivy, and the door closed gently behind her. Chapter 3. The Courtyard of Echoes. The ivy brushed softly against her shoulder as Elena stepped through the narrow doorway, the coolness of the stone giving way once again to sunlight. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the new brightness. Before her stretched another courtyard, and with it another rhythm of life, as though each space were a separate world with its own heartbeat. This courtyard was smaller than the last, yet it seemed somehow more alive. The fountain at its center was not a wide pool, but a tall, slender column from which water spilled delicately into a basin below. The sound was higher, lighter, not the deep melody of cascading tears, but a playful whisper, as if the water itself carried secrets. Elena paused at the edge, taking in the scene. Several people moved quietly through the space. A young man leaned against one of the arches, a folded piece of paper in his hands. He unfolded it slowly, his brow furrowed, and began to read aloud in a low voice. The words carried only fragments across the courtyard. She could not hear them clearly, but the rhythm of his tone reached her, soft and steady, like the cadence of a story told not to be understood, but simply to be felt. Nearby, a little girl balanced carefully on the edge of the fountain's basin, her arms stretched wide like a bird testing its wings. She giggled when her foot slipped slightly, but she did not fall. Instead, she righted herself with surprising grace, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of her daring. A woman who might have been her mother watched from a bench beneath the arches, her smile indulgent, her hands busy with embroidery that caught glints of sunlight in its thread. Two women, seated together on a tiled bench, whispered back and forth, their heads bent close. Their conversation was quick and light, their laughter bubbling up in sudden bursts before subsiding into murmurs once again. One of them held a small mirror in her lap, turning it slightly so that the sun danced across her friend's face. Elena watched the way they leaned toward each other, their gestures filled with ease, as though they had shared 100 such afternoons. Elena found a place to sit on the low stone wall that edged the courtyard. The warmth of the stone pressed into her palms as she settled there, her eyes wandering from one figure to the next. She felt again that quiet sense of people watching, of slipping into the currents of other lives without disturbing them. Her gaze returned to the young man with the paper. He seemed lost in his own world, his lips moving steadily, the creases on his brow softening as he read. Elena imagined that he was rehearsing a letter, perhaps one he hoped to give to someone he loved. She could almost hear his thoughts. the careful choosing of words, the hope that they might be enough. She felt a tug in her chest, remembering moments when words had carried the weight of her own heart. The little girl at the fountain stretched her arms wider still, tilting her head back so that the sun caught her face. She laughed again, louder this time, and Eleanor smiled. The innocence of it touched her, that fearless balance, the joy of risk without thought of falling. She wondered when she herself had last felt so free, so untouched by caution. The women with the mirror leaned closer together, their voices rising just enough for Elena to catch a few words. Laughter about someone's song, the way it lingered in their minds. She watched their faces, radiant with the ease of friendship, and felt her own lips curve. Friendship, she thought, was like sunlight. It illuminated everything it touched, even when the world beyond remained shadowed. From above, the swallows returned, darting across the sky as though they too belonged to every courtyard. Their wings flickered with light as they swooped low over the fountain, startling the little girl, who clapped her hands in delight. The young man with the paper looked up briefly, his words pausing, then continued as if the swallows had blessed his reading. Elena leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. The warmth of the day pressed gently against her, while the cool scent of ivy and roses drifted in from the corners. The courtyard seemed to breathe with her, its life unfolding in gentle layers. The whisper of water, the murmur of voices, the laughter that rose like a bird taking flight. When she opened her eyes again, her gaze fell on a doorway at the far end. Unlike the narrow, ivy-covered entrance she had just passed, this doorway was framed by intricate carvings, patterns that spiraled like vines caught in stone. The sight stirred something in her. Not urgency, but a soft curiosity, like a thread pulling her forward. Still, she lingered. She watched the people once more, memorizing the scene. The young man folded his paper at last, pressing it to his chest as though to seal its words inside him. He glanced once toward the sunlight, his eyes thoughtful, then tucked the paper into his pocket. The little girl hopped down from the fountain's edge, rushing to her mother's side, where she was gathered into gentle arms that smelled of thread and patience. The two women with the mirror laughed again, their joy spilling outward like light through stained glass. Elena rose quietly, her hand brushing the folds of her dress. She took one last look around the courtyard, feeling as though she were carrying each of them with her. The boys' daring, the women's laughter, the young man's quiet hope. She turned toward the carved doorway. As her steps echoed across the tiled floor, she felt a hush settle over her, as though the courtyard itself were bidding her farewell. When she reached the door, she laid her hand on its patterns, tracing the grooves worn smooth by countless others. She breathed in once more the mingled scents of blossoms and sunlight, then stepped forward. The door opened easily, and the courtyard of echoes faded behind her. Chapter 4. The Courtyard of Stories. The carved doorway closed softly behind Elena, the sound barely louder than the sigh of the fountain she had left behind. She lingered a moment in the shadowed passage, her fingers still tingling from the patterns she had traced into the stone. Ahead, the air shifted once more, carrying with it a murmur she could not yet name. Not only water, not only voices, but something threaded between the two. She stepped forward. The passage opened suddenly, spilling her into a courtyard brighter than the ones before. Here, sunlight streamed freely, falling across the tiles like a golden net. The fountain in this courtyard was broad and low, its water spilling gently over the rim, creating a shallow pool that reflected the sky. The sound was softer than a trickle, more like the steady breathing of the earth itself. Around the fountain, people were gathered, not in haste, not in noise, but gathered nonetheless, as if the fountain had drawn them with an unspoken invitation. Elena paused at the edge, watching. A man sat cross-legged on the far side of the fountain, a lute resting lightly against his knees. His fingers strummed not a full song, but fragments, phrases of music that hung in the air like threads of silk before fading. He did not seem to mind their incompleteness. His gaze was distant, his smile faint, as though the music was not for performance, but for the quiet stitching together of his own heart. Beside him, two children crouched at the edge of the pool. They floated leaves on its surface, each one carrying a pebble placed carefully at its center. When the leaves drifted, the pebbles shifted their weight, causing the makeshift boats to spin lazily. The children laughed softly at each new path their boats took, clapping when two collided gently and spun away again. Near the arches, an older woman told a story. Her hands moved slowly in the air as she spoke, shaping her words like clay, though her voice was low and Eleanor could not hear all of it. Around her sat three listeners, a young mother holding her sleeping baby, a boy not yet 10 with knees scraped from play, and another woman with silver hair coiled neatly at the back of her head. Their faces tilted upward toward the storyteller, their eyes soft and intent, drawn to the shape of her voice more than the details of her tale. Elena stepped further inside, drawn by the quiet pulse of life unfolding here. She found a seat on the low wall that circled the courtyard. The stone was warm against her palms. From here, she could see them all. The man with his lute, the children with their leaf boats, the storyteller and her listeners. Each seemed to belong not only to themselves, but to the courtyard as well, as though the walls held their stories and their silences in equal measure. Her gaze lingered on the musician. His fingers brushed the strings almost absent-mindedly, yet the sound that came forth was tender, filled with a kind of longing that settled into the air. Eleanor imagined that he was not playing for others, but for someone far away. Perhaps someone he had once known, perhaps someone he hoped still listened. His unfinished songs felt like letters never sent, yet carried faithfully by the wind. The children giggled again, their voices chiming like bells. One leaf boat spun quickly, its pebble tipping it just enough to make it wobble before steadying itself again. The boy clapped in delight, while the girl leaned closer, her braid brushing the water's surface. Elena smiled. The sight touched something in her, a memory of games played with whatever the world offered, leaves, stones, puddles after rain, joy that needed nothing more than the moment at hand. Her gaze shifted to the storyteller. The woman's hands moved slowly, her fingers rising and falling with the rhythm of her tale. Elena could not hear the words clearly, but she could feel the story's shape, something about journeys, something about return. The boy leaned forward, his scraped knees forgotten, his eyes wide. The young mother rocked her baby gently, though her gaze did not leave the storyteller's face. And the silver-haired woman smiled softly, as if she already knew the ending but cherished the telling nonetheless. Elena let her thoughts wander, weaving her own imaginings around the people she watched. The musician, perhaps he carried a song he could not finish because its ending belonged to someone else. Perhaps the courtyard gave him the space to let it linger, incomplete but alive. The children. Perhaps they would remember this game years from now, long after the leaves and pebbles had vanished. Perhaps they would remember the way sunlight glittered on water, the way laughter turned something so small into something vast. The storyteller, perhaps she had told this tale many times, but each telling shaped it anew, like water-carving stone. Perhaps she knew that stories were not meant to be kept, but shared, breathed into life again and again. Eleanor leaned back, closing her eyes briefly. The sounds of the courtyard wrapped around her, the soft pluck of strings, the giggle of children, the low murmur of a story. She breathed it in, letting it settle into her chest. When she opened her eyes again, she noticed something she had missed before. On the far wall, half hidden by climbing vines, another doorway waited. This one was tall and narrow, framed not by carvings but by painted tiles in shades of deep blue and green. The colors shimmered faintly where sunlight touched them, as though the tiles themselves held water within. She felt curiosity stir again, but she did not rise. Not yet. Instead, she looked once more at the people around her, holding them in her gaze as though memorizing a painting. The musician lowered his lute at last, pressing his hand briefly against its strings to still their echo. The children blew across the surface of the water, sending their leaf boats drifting faster, their laughter trailing after them. The storyteller lifted her hands in a final gesture, her voice falling into silence. Her listeners sat quietly for a moment, as though the air itself wished to hold on to the last words. Elena felt something within her soften. The courtyard, with its stories and its silences, seemed to breathe with her own heart. She rose slowly, brushing the folds of her dress, and turned toward the tiled doorway. As she stepped closer, the tiles gleamed more brightly, the blues deepening, the greens shimmering like moss beneath water. She reached out her hand, her fingers brushing the cool surface. For a moment she thought she felt movement beneath her touch, not stone but current. She smiled softly, breathing in the mingled scents of ivy and roses, and stepped forward. The courtyard of stories faded behind her. Chapter 5. The Courtyard of Colors. The tiled doorway closed behind Elena with a soft hush, its cool surface lingering on her fingertips like the memory of water. She stepped into a narrow passage, the air dim and hushed, vines brushing gently against her shoulders. The ground beneath her feet was patterned with shifting light, the kind that dances when sun filters through leaves. She moved slowly, listening to the faint hum of voices ahead, threaded with the constant whisper of water. When she emerged, her breath caught. This courtyard was unlike the others. Here, color bloomed everywhere, as if the walls themselves had been painted by the sun. Tiles in shades of turquoise and amber shimmered beneath her feet, forming shapes that seemed to shift as she walked. Along the walls, mosaic panels glowed with patterns of stars and flowers, each one glinting with tiny pieces of glass that caught the light. The fountain at the center was shallower than the others, its basin wide and tiled in bright blues and greens. Water poured from 4 narrow spouts, each stream arcing gracefully into the pool below, where sunlight scattered across the ripples like spilled gold. And around this fountain more people lingered. A painter sat near the edge, his easel propped against the wall. His brush moved with delicate precision, dabbing color onto the canvas before him. Eleanor could not see the whole image, but she caught glimpses, fragments of the courtyard itself, transformed into strokes of light and shadow. The painter's brow was furrowed, yet his movements were steady, his face softened by the quiet devotion of someone who painted not for an audience but for the joy of capturing beauty as it breathed. Beside the fountain, 2 young sisters played with scraps of fabric dyed in bright colors. They dipped the cloth into the water and wrung it out, watching as the sun lit the wet fabric into jeweled tones, crimson, sapphire, emerald. Then, laughing, they spread the cloths across the tiles, letting them dry into patches of shifting brilliance. A man with a basket of fruit wandered near the arches. He paused to offer oranges and figs to those seated nearby, his voice low and kind. Some accepted with quiet thanks, others simply smiled, content to watch him move slowly, as if his offering was less about the fruit and more about the act of giving itself. Elena settled on a bench beneath a lemon tree, her dress catching the warm breeze. She folded her hands in her lap and allowed her gaze to drift, people watching as she always did. The painter, his devotion stirred something in her. She thought of moments when she too had tried to capture the world in memory, to hold a fleeting color or sound inside her. She wondered if he painted for himself alone, or for someone who might one day see through his eyes. The sisters, Their laughter rang like bells, each scrap of wet fabric transforming into something magical beneath the sun. Elena smiled, remembering how simple things had once seemed magical in her own childhood. A puddle, a shadow, the flutter of a curtain in the wind. The man with the basket. His steps were slow, deliberate. She imagined his life, perhaps walking these courtyards each day, carrying fruit not as a task but as a ritual of kindness. She thought of how rare such gestures were in the world beyond the walls, where time often rushed too quickly to allow them. Above, the swallows circled again, their wings cutting playful arcs through the bright sky. Their shadows darted across the mosaics, flickering like pieces of moving glass. The sisters clapped, chasing the shadows with their fabric scraps, while the painter looked up briefly, smiling at their laughter before returning to his work. Elena leaned back against the bench, closing her eyes. The scents here were sharper: citrus, figs, roses mingling with the faint tang of wet tile. She breathed it in, letting the courtyard seep into her. Around her, voices and laughter ebbed and flowed, blending with the gentle music of water. When she opened her eyes again, she noticed another doorway. This one was wide, framed with pale stone, its surface carved with simple patterns of vines and flowers. No shimmer of tiles, no ornate carvings, only quiet beauty, understated and inviting. But she did not rise, not yet. She lingered, letting her gaze rest once more on the people. The painter dipped his brush again, his face bathed in light. The sisters stretched their fabric toward the sun, their laughter ringing clear. The man with the basket handed the last orange to a boy who had been sitting silently by the wall, his face breaking into a smile as he accepted it. Eleanor felt her chest warm. This courtyard, filled with colors and kindness, seemed to paint itself into her heart. She knew she would carry it with her, just as she carried all the others. At last, she rose. Her steps echoed softly across the tiles as she moved toward the pale doorway. Her hand brushed its carved vines, tracing the grooves gently, as though she were greeting an old friend. She breathed once more the mingled scents of citrus and roses, then stepped forward. The courtyard of colors faded behind her. Chapter 6. The courtyard of echoed steps. The pale doorway closed behind Elena with a whisper, leaving her surrounded by quiet shadow. She moved carefully, her sandals brushing over stone smoothed by countless feet before hers. The passage curved gently, as though it had learned the art of patience, leading her forward without haste. The faint scent of stone and cool earth lingered, threaded with the promise of sunlight ahead. When she stepped out, she found herself in a courtyard unlike any she had yet seen. This space was broad and open to the sky, framed by walls of soft sandstone that glowed warmly in the afternoon light. Arches stretched tall and elegant, their shapes laced with delicate carvings, patterns of stars and flowers repeating endlessly, as though they carried whispers from another age. Above them, tiles of deep cobalt and emerald shimmered, reflecting both sunlight and memory. Elena felt her breath slow. This courtyard carried with it a different rhythm, not only of water and roses, but of history itself, pressed gently into every tile and stone. At the center, a rectangular pool stretched long and narrow, its surface calm as glass. The water reflected the sky so clearly that it seemed a second heaven had been laid upon the earth. Along its edges, rows of orange trees stood in perfect symmetry, their blossoms scattering faint perfume into the air. The pool mirrored their shapes, doubling the quiet beauty until it felt endless. People moved quietly through the space. Some strolled along the edges of the pool, their reflections walking with them in silence. Others sat in the shade of the orange trees, sketching patterns into notebooks, their pencils scratching faintly in rhythm with the trickle of a small fountain at the pool's end. Elena walked slowly, her gaze lingering on the carvings along the arches. The shapes were familiar in their rhythm, yet foreign in their precision. Geometric stars, endless knots, vines curling into eternity. She thought of how many hands had carved them, how each stroke of chisel and hammer had been given not only for beauty but for devotion. She settled on a stone bench, shaded by one of the orange trees. The leaves above her rustled softly, the blossoms releasing their scent into the air like a lullaby. From here, she could see both the pool and the people gathered around it. Not far away, a man in a white tunic knelt near the water, dipping a brush into a shallow dish of ink. With slow care, he pressed the brush against a sheet of parchment, forming curling lines that grew into words. Elena could not read them, but she recognized the beauty of their flow, each stroke carrying rhythm and grace. She thought of calligraphy not only as writing, but as a kind of music, a song given to paper. Further down, a group of travelers sat cross-legged on the tiled floor, their shoes set neatly aside. One of them strummed a small oud, its strings releasing notes that rose and fell like gentle waves. Another tapped softly on a drum, no larger than his hands, adding heartbeat to melody. Their music did not intrude upon the silence. It wove into it, like sunlight slipping through branches. Near the far end of the pool, two women embroidered cloth. Their fingers moved steadily, threading colors into patterns of flowers and stars. One paused often to hold the fabric up to the light, watching how the threads gleamed like tiny rivers across the cloth. Elena watched them for a long while, entranced by the rhythm of their work. It reminded her of the tiles around her, each stitch like a fragment of mosaic patiently laid into place. Elena leaned back against the bench, closing her eyes briefly. The air carried layers of sound, water trickling, pencil scratching, lute strings humming, embroidery needles slipping through fabric. None of it was hurried, none of it loud. Together, the sounds blended into a harmony of patience, the kind that soothed rather than stirred. She thought of Granada itself, a city where so many cultures had crossed paths, leaving behind arches and mosaics, gardens and songs. She imagined the voices of the past lingering in these courtyards, not as ghosts but as gentle echoes. Every orange blossom that fell seemed to carry a memory of hands that had planted, watered, tended. Every carved star in the arches seemed to hold the thought of someone who had once tilted their face toward the heavens. Her gaze drifted toward the calligrapher again. His hand was steady, his ink flowing like water. She wondered what words he wrote, perhaps poetry, perhaps prayer. Perhaps the words themselves did not matter, only the devotion given to shaping them. The oud player plucked a melody so soft it seemed to rise from the pool itself. The sound shimmered over the water, blending with the reflection of the sky. Elena smiled faintly, imagining the notes as drops of sunlight falling onto the surface, sending ripples outward. The women with their embroidery laughed quietly, one leaning to whisper to the other. Their cloths grew brighter with every stitch, as though they were weaving light itself into the fabric. Elena thought of how such cloth might one day be worn, carried into the world, still holding the patience of this moment within its threads. Above, swallows swept low, their wings grazing the surface of the pool before darting skyward again. Their shadows crossed over the calligrapher's parchment, over the embroidered cloth, over Eleanor herself. The air shimmered with movement yet remained calm. She stayed like that for a long while, her thoughts wandering gently. She felt no need to move, no need to speak. The courtyard itself seemed to speak for her, its culture and history unfolding softly, like petals opening beneath the sun. When at last her gaze shifted, she noticed another doorway at the far end. This one was tall and arched, its frame simple, its surface unadorned. Yet beyond it, Elena could sense another courtyard waiting, another world, another rhythm. Still, she lingered. The calligrapher laid his brush aside, lifting the parchment gently as though it were fragile glass. The oud player ended his song with a final note that hovered in the air like a sigh. The women folded their embroidery neatly into their laps, their smiles still glowing in the light. Elena rose slowly, brushing the folds of her dress. She felt the weight of the courtyard in her heart, its colors, its patience, its gentle echoes of devotion. She walked to the tall doorway, her hand brushing lightly against the stone as though greeting it. She breathed once more the mingled scents of orange blossoms, ink, and roses. Then, with quiet certainty, she stepped forward. The courtyard of echoed steps faded behind her. Chapter 7. The Courtyard of Whispers. The tall doorway she had passed through closed behind her with the faintest sigh, and for a moment Elena stood in shadow once more. The air here was cooler, carrying a faint trace of damp stone and jasmine. Her footsteps echoed softly as she moved forward, following the curve of the passage until light spilled ahead. When she stepped out, the light was gentler than before, filtered through latticed screens and climbing vines that cast patterns of shadow across the tiled floor. This courtyard felt more secret, more hidden, as though it had been tucked away for those who sought quiet rather than splendor. At its center stood a circular fountain, smaller than the others she had seen. Water bubbled softly from a bronze spout shaped like a lion's head, trickling into the basin below. The sound was low, almost a whisper, blending with the rustle of leaves overhead. Around the fountain, shaded benches invited stillness, and clusters of potted herbs filled the air with a subtle fragrance of mint, rosemary, and thyme. Elena breathed in deeply. The courtyard felt different, not only quieter but more intimate, as if it held its secrets close. People were here too, though fewer than in the courtyards before. Near the fountain, a young woman sat with a book balanced on her knees. Her hair fell across her face as she leaned over the pages, lips moving silently, as though she read not for knowledge but for comfort. Occasionally, she would smile faintly, as if the words were telling her something only her heart could hear. Across from her, two older men played chess at a stone table built into the wall. Their pieces were carved from wood, worn smooth with use. One man leaned forward, studying the board intently, while the other leaned back, his hand resting against his chin, a smile flickering at the corner of his mouth. Their movements were slow, deliberate, each piece placed with the gravity of ritual rather than competition. By the far wall, a woman in a dark shawl sat weaving a small basket from reeds. Her fingers moved with quiet precision, bending and folding, shaping the basket into form. A boy, perhaps her grandson, knelt beside her, watching intently. Every so often she guided his hands, showing him how to weave the strands. Her voice so soft that Elena could not hear the words, only the rhythm of her guidance. Elena chose a bench near the fountain and sat, her hands resting in her lap. The air around her felt hushed, like the pause between lines of a song. She let her gaze wander, her thoughts drifting as she watched. The young woman with the book. Eleanor imagined the pages were filled with poetry, words that whispered not of grand stories, but of small, quiet truths. She thought of the comfort found in words that seemed written just for oneself, words that could sit gently inside the heart like a candle flame. The men at the chessboard, their game unfolded not as a battle but as a dance. Each move seemed less about winning and more about honoring the ritual, a way of passing time that carried memory within it. Elena wondered how many afternoons they had sat like this, how many games had ended in laughter, in silence, in stories shared between moves. The basket weaver, her fingers shaped not only reeds, but also patience, teaching the boy how something useful could also be beautiful. Elena thought of how knowledge traveled this way, not through books or speeches, but through the quiet repetition of hands working side by side. Above, a swallow darted through the lattice of vines, its wings catching light for just a moment before disappearing again. The fountain's whisper carried on, steady and soft. Elena leaned back against the bench, closing her eyes. She let the sounds wash over her. The faint scrape of chess pieces, the soft rustle of pages turning, the weaving of reeds, the trickle of water. Each sound was small, yet together they formed a harmony, a kind of whispered music that settled into her chest. Her mind wandered. She thought of how courtyards were like hearts, enclosed, sheltered, yet open to the sky. Each one she had walked through carried its own rhythm, its own quiet pulse. This one was not filled with colors or music or embroidered cloths. Instead, it was filled with whispers, of books, of games, of teaching, of water. When she opened her eyes again, she noticed another figure she had not seen before. Near the far corner, beneath a fig tree, an old woman sat humming softly. Her hands rested in her lap, her eyes half closed. The tune was simple, no more than a handful of notes repeated again and again, but it filled the air with a sense of timelessness. Elena watched her for a long while, feeling the hum vibrate gently in her own chest, as though the courtyard itself were breathing through her song. The boy looked up from his basket, weaving, and smiled at the woman humming. He tapped his grandmother's arm and whispered something that made her laugh quietly. The sound was light, unhurried, and it seemed to ripple outward, touching everyone in the courtyard without disturbing them. The chess players paused briefly, their eyes lifting from the board, their smiles answering the laughter. The young woman with the book glanced up as well, her lips curving into a quiet smile before she bent again to her pages. Elena's heart softened. She felt as though she were part of the courtyard now, stitched into its whispers, its small harmonies. After some time, her gaze drifted toward a doorway hidden behind the vines. It was small, almost concealed, framed with plain stone. No carvings, no tiles, only a simple arch that seemed to wait patiently. Still, she did not rise immediately. She lingered, watching. The chess game continued, one man finally moving his knight with a small sigh of satisfaction. The other laughed, shaking his head before plotting his next move. The book closed softly, the young woman tucking a sprig of rosemary between its pages as a marker. The boy lifted the half-finished basket, proud of its shape, while his grandmother nodded with approval. And the old woman beneath the fig tree hummed on, her tune as steady as the fountain's whisper. Elena breathed deeply, letting the sense of mint, jasmine, and whetstone fill her lungs. She rose slowly, her dress brushing lightly against the bench. She walked toward the small doorway, her hand brushing the vines aside. For a moment she turned back. She saw them all as if in a painting, the chess game, the book, the basket, the humming song, the fountain. She felt the courtyard settle inside her, another piece of quiet beauty to carry forward. Then, with a gentle step, she passed through the vine-framed arch. The courtyard of whispers faded behind her. Chapter 8. The Courtyard of Lanterns. The vine-framed arch closed gently behind Eleanor, leaving only the faint perfume of rosemary and mint in its wake. The passage she stepped into was narrow, its walls warm with the touch of sun. A small window high above allowed a stream of light to fall like a ribbon, shifting across the stone as if the building itself were breathing. Her footsteps echoed softly, each one steady, unhurried, guiding her forward. She could hear water again, faint and delicate, threaded now with the low murmur of voices. She followed the sounds until the passage widened and light opened around her. The new courtyard was filled with lanterns. They hung from iron hooks along the walls, from branches of pomegranate and lemon trees, from archways carved with quiet patience. Each lantern was made of colored glass, ruby, amber, sapphire, emerald, their panes catching the afternoon light so that the whole courtyard shimmered like a mosaic come to life. Even unlit, the lanterns glowed, sunlight spilling through them in jeweled patterns that painted the tiles below. At the center stood a hexagonal fountain, its basin carved from pale stone. Water rose gently from a brass spout shaped like a star, trickling down into the pool with a sound as soft as a lullaby. The water carried with it shifting reflections of the lanterns, as though the fountain itself were a vessel of light. Elena paused at the edge, her heart easing into the quiet magic of it. People were gathered here too, each drawn into their own rhythm of stillness. Near the fountain, a young boy polished the glass panes of a lantern with a cloth, his small hands moving carefully, his eyes intent on every corner. He worked slowly, as though he knew the lantern held more than glass, as though he were tending to something sacred. Across the courtyard, an old man sat on a low stool, a half-finished lantern resting on his lap. Thin strips of bronze framed the pieces of colored glass he was fitting together. His fingers moved with steady precision, shaping light into form. A younger man knelt beside him, watching closely, asking questions in a voice so low Elena could not hear the words. The older man nodded often, sometimes taking the younger's hands to guide them, showing how to bend the metal gently without breaking it. At one corner, a woman sat surrounded by threads of silk in every shade. Her fingers worked a needle through fabric stretched across a frame, embroidering lantern-shaped patterns into a length of cloth. The silk shimmered in the sun, each stitch catching light like a spark. A girl no older than 8 sat beside her, choosing the threads, holding each one up to the light before handing it over with careful pride. Near the arches, 2 men played a soft tune on flutes carved from reed. Their music was light and winding, weaving in and out of the fountain's trickle. It rose, curled, and settled like smoke in the air, carrying with it a rhythm that seemed to belong to the lanterns themselves. Eleanor found a place on a stone bench, shaded by a pomegranate tree. The fruit hung heavy on the branches above her, their skins flushed deep red, glowing in the filtered light. She sat quietly, folding her hands in her lap, and let her gaze drift. The boy with the cloth. She thought of how carefully he polished, his face lit with devotion. She imagined how, when the lantern was lit at night, he would see his reflection in the glass, and know he had left his mark on its light. The old man and his student. Elena felt the rhythm of their exchange, knowledge passing gently from one set of hands to another. She thought of how lanterns, like wisdom, were built piece by piece, each one shaped by both patience and care. The woman with her embroidery, her threads glowed like sunlight captured in silk. Eleanor wondered if the cloth might one day hang beside the lanterns, carrying their shapes into another form of light. The little girl's eagerness touched her, a reminder of how beauty often begins in the simple joy of choosing colors. The flute players, their music was so soft it seemed almost part of the air itself. Elena imagined the lanterns leaning toward the sound, glowing a little brighter with each note. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the scents of pomegranate, lemon and silk warmed by the sun. Around her, the courtyard seemed to hum, not loudly, but like a secret melody only those who lingered long enough could hear. Her mind drifted back to the history of lanterns in this place, not in detail, but in impression. She thought of nights when these glass vessels would glow with flame, their colors spilling across the walls like living mosaics. She imagined families gathering, travelers resting, music and stories shared beneath the lantern light. The thought settled inside her like a memory she had not lived but could somehow feel. When she opened her eyes again, her gaze wandered to the far wall. There, a wide archway opened into shadow. Its frame was simple, lined with pale stone, yet above it hung a lantern larger than the rest, its glass panes the color of deep sapphire. Sunlight spilled through it, painting the archway in blue. Elena did not rise yet. she stayed where she was, watching. The boy polished the last pane of glass and held the lantern up proudly, its ruby and amber surfaces glowing like captured sunset. The old man tightened the final strip of bronze around a lantern frame, handing it carefully to his student, who smiled as though holding treasure. The woman with her silk lifted her cloth, its lanterns embroidered in gold thread, shimmering as if already lit from within. The flute players let their melody fade into silence, their flutes resting softly on their knees. Elena's heart filled with a quiet warmth. She felt as though she were carrying lantern light inside her now, the glow of patience, kindness, and devotion settling deep within. At last, she rose. Her sandals touched the patterned tiles with soft echoes as she walked toward the blue-lit archway. Her hand brushed briefly against the pale stone, then lingered for a moment beneath the sapphire glow. She breathed in the mingled scents of silk, fruit, and warm stone. Then, with a gentle step, she passed beneath the arch. The courtyard of lanterns faded behind her. Chapter 9. The Courtyard of Strings. The archway bathed in sapphire light gave way to a narrow passage. Here the air was cool, touched with the faint mineral scent of stone. Elena walked slowly, her fingers brushing the wall, feeling its quiet hum beneath her skin. Somewhere ahead, she could hear music, faint at first, a thread of sound woven into silence. She followed it, step by unhurried step, until the passage opened into a wide courtyard. This one breathed music. At its center was a circular fountain, low and broad, where water spilled gently from 3 bronze spouts shaped like lilies. The water did not rush. It trickled steadily, carrying with it a rhythm that blended seamlessly with the notes drifting through the air. Around the fountain, benches and cushions had been scattered, their fabric woven in reds, ochres, and soft indigos that glowed beneath the late afternoon sun. Lanterns hung here too, though fewer than in the courtyard before. They were clear glass, not colored, allowing the sunlight to pass through them freely, casting pure light across the patterned tiles. And everywhere there was music. A man sat cross-legged near the fountain, plucking at the strings of a guitar. His hands moved slowly, coaxing out notes that shimmered in the warm air. The sound was not hurried, not loud, but soft and fluid, as though he were speaking to the water itself. Beside him, a woman played a lute, her fingers dancing lightly across the strings. She leaned slightly as she played, her face serene, her eyes half closed, as if she too were drifting inside the music. Not far from them, a boy sat with a small drum resting between his knees. His palms tapped out a rhythm so gentle it felt like a heartbeat, steady and grounding, blending with the trickle of the fountain. Occasionally, he looked up at the older musicians, his smile wide when their melodies wove around his rhythm. In the shade of an arch, an elderly man tuned a violin. The strings gave out soft hums as he adjusted them, each note slipping into place like a thread being drawn tight. When he lifted the bow, the first sound was delicate, trembling, then steadied into a clear tone that joined the guitar, lute, and drum. Elena stood at the edge for a long while, listening. The music rose and fell like breath, weaving itself around the courtyard. It was not performance. No one clapped, no one hurried. It was conversation. Notes spoke to one another, answered one another, blending into a harmony that felt as old as the stone beneath her feet. She moved quietly to a bench near the fountain and sat. The cushions gave beneath her, soft and welcoming, their fabric faintly perfumed with cedar. She folded her hands in her lap and let the music wash through her. Her eyes wandered from one musician to another. The guitarist's fingers moved with patience, never rushing, each note given space to linger. Eleanor thought of how some people carried silence inside them, letting it breathe between their words. His music was like that, filled with pauses that made each note glow brighter. The lute player leaned into her melody, her hands fluid, graceful. Elena imagined she had played since childhood, that her instrument was less an object and more a companion. The lute's voice carried warmth, like sunlight poured into sound. The boy with the drum tapped steadily, his rhythm unbroken. Elena thought of how the world often overlooked such things, the quiet beats that held everything together. Yet without him, the music would not have carried the same calm pulse. The violinist lifted his bow again, and Elena closed her eyes. The sound was soft at first, then opened like a flower, each note unfurling into the air. It brushed against her skin, delicate as silk, carrying with it something both fragile and strong. Around the courtyard, others listened too. A woman with her hair braided in silver sat with her hands folded, her eyes closed as though she were drinking in the music. A pair of children leaned against each other on a cushion, their heads nodding gently with the rhythm. A man leaned against the wall, sketching quickly in a notebook, his pencil catching the curves of musicians and fountain alike. Elena's breath slowed. The courtyard seemed to dissolve into sound. The fountains trickle, the strings hum, the drums heartbeat, the silence between. It wrapped around her, soft and steady, a lullaby not meant to end. Her thoughts wandered. She imagined the guitar carrying stories of travelers who had crossed deserts and mountains. The lute held memories of songs sung in courtyards like this for centuries, passed from one generation to another. The drum kept time not just for the music, but for the heart itself, steadying all who listened. And the violin, fragile, trembling, yet strong, felt like a reminder that beauty did not need to be perfect, only true. Elena opened her eyes slowly. The sunlight had shifted, turning golden, casting long patterns across the tiles. The musicians played on, their notes drifting like lanterns across the water's surface. She thought of how music stitched people together without need for words, binding them with sound as gentle as breath. Her gaze drifted to a doorway at the far end of the courtyard. This one was tall, framed with marble, its arch wide and welcoming. Above it, vines spilled downward, their leaves catching the last rays of sun. The air near it shimmered faintly, as though inviting her forward. Still, she lingered. The guitarist played one final phrase, letting the note fade into silence. The lute followed with a low chord, warm and steady. The boy tapped his drum lightly 3 times, then let his hands rest. The violinist drew his bow across the string in a final sigh of sound. The music ended not with applause, but with stillness. The fountain's trickle filled the silence, as though carrying the song onward. Elena rose slowly. She brushed her dress with her hands, her heart still filled with the echo of strings and water. She turned toward the marble doorway, her sandals whispering across the tiles. She paused at its frame, her fingers brushing the cool stone. She breathed in the mingled scents of cedar, roses, and sun-warmed air. Then, with a gentle certainty, she stepped forward. The courtyard of strings faded behind her. Chapter 9. The Courtyard of Strings. The archway, bathed in sapphire light, gave way to a narrow passage. Here the air was cool, touched with the faint mineral scent of stone. Elena walked slowly, her fingers brushing the wall, feeling its quiet hum beneath her skin. Somewhere ahead she could hear music. Faint at first, a thread of sound woven into silence. She followed it, step by unhurried step, until the passage opened into a wide courtyard. This one breathed music. At its center was a circular fountain, low and broad, where water spilled gently from 3 bronze spouts shaped like lilies. The water did not rush. It trickled steadily, carrying with it a rhythm that blended seamlessly with the notes drifting through the air. Around the fountain, benches and cushions had been scattered, their fabric woven in reds, ochres, and soft indigos that glowed beneath the late afternoon sun. Lanterns hung here too, though fewer than in the courtyard before. They were clear glass, not colored, allowing the sunlight to pass through them freely, casting pure light across the patterned tiles. And everywhere there was music. A man sat cross-legged near the fountain, plucking at the strings of a guitar. His hands moved slowly, coaxing out notes that shimmered in the warm air. The sound was not hurried, not loud, but soft and fluid, as though he were speaking to the water itself. Beside him, a woman played a lute, her fingers dancing lightly across the strings. She leaned slightly as she played, her face serene, her eyes half closed, as if she too were drifting inside the music. Not far from them, a boy sat with a small drum resting between his knees. His palms tapped out a rhythm so gentle it felt like a heartbeat, steady and grounding, blending with the trickle of the fountain. Occasionally, he looked up at the older musicians, his smile wide when their melodies wove around his rhythm. In the shade of an arch, an elderly man tuned a violin. The strings gave out soft hums as he adjusted them, each note slipping into place like a thread being drawn tight. When he lifted the bow, the first sound was delicate, trembling, then steadied into a clear tone that joined the guitar, lute, and drum. Elena stood at the edge for a long while, listening. The music rose and fell like breath, weaving itself around the courtyard. It was not performance. No one clapped. No one hurried. It was conversation. Notes spoke to one another, answered one another, blending into a harmony that felt as old as the stone beneath her feet. She moved quietly to a bench near the fountain and sat. The cushions gave beneath her, soft and welcoming, their fabric faintly perfumed with cedar. She folded her hands in her lap and let the music wash through her. Her eyes wandered from one musician to another. The guitarist's fingers moved with patience, never rushing, each note given space to linger. Eleanor thought of how some people carried silence inside them, letting it breathe between their words. His music was like that, filled with pauses that made each note glow brighter. The lute player leaned into her melody, her hands fluid, graceful. Elena imagined she had played since childhood, that her instrument was less an object and more a companion. The lute's voice carried warmth, like sunlight poured into sound. The boy with the drum tapped steadily, his rhythm unbroken. Elena thought of how the world often overlooked such things, the quiet beats that held everything together. Yet without him, the music would not have carried the same calm pulse. The violinist lifted his bow again, and Elena closed her eyes. The sound was soft at first, then opened like a flower, each note unfurling into the air. It brushed against her skin, delicate as silk, carrying with it something both fragile and strong. Around the courtyard, others listened too. A woman with her hair braided in silver sat with her hands folded, her eyes closed as though she were drinking in the music. A pair of children leaned against each other on a cushion, their heads nodding gently with the rhythm. A man leaned against the wall, sketching quickly in a notebook, his pencil catching the curves of musicians and fountain alike. Elena's breath slowed. The courtyard seemed to dissolve into sound, the fountain's trickle, the strings hum, the drum's heartbeat, the silence between. It wrapped around her, soft and steady, a lullaby not meant to end. Her thoughts wandered. She imagined the guitar carrying stories of travelers who had crossed deserts and mountains. The lute held memories of songs sung in courtyards like this for centuries, passed from one generation to another. The drum kept time not just for the music, but for the heart itself, steadying all who listened. And the violin, fragile, trembling yet strong, felt like a reminder that beauty did not need to be perfect, only true. Elena opened her eyes slowly. The sunlight had shifted, turning golden, casting long patterns across the tiles. The musicians played on, their notes drifting like lanterns across the water's surface. She thought of how music stitched people together, without need for words. binding them with sound as gentle as breath. Her gaze drifted to a doorway at the far end of the courtyard. This one was tall, framed with marble, its arch wide and welcoming. Above it, vines spilled downward, their leaves catching the last rays of sun. The air near it shimmered faintly, as though inviting her forward. Still, she lingered. The guitarist played one final phrase, letting the note fade into silence. The lute followed with a low chord, warm and steady. The boy tapped his drum lightly 3 times, then let his hands rest. The violinist drew his bow across the string in a final sigh of sound. The music ended not with applause, but with stillness. The fountain's trickle filled the silence, as though carrying the song onward. Eleanor rose slowly. She brushed her dress with her hands, her heart still filled with the echo of strings and water. She turned toward the marble doorway, her sandals whispering across the tiles. She paused at its frame, her fingers brushing the cool stone. She breathed in the mingled scents of cedar, roses, and sun-warmed air. Then, with a gentle certainty, she stepped forward. The courtyard of strings faded behind her. Chapter 11. The Courtyard of Flavors. The tapestry slipped from Elena's hand as she stepped through the doorway, its fabric falling back into place with a faint sigh. She found herself in another shaded passage, the air carrying a new fragrance, warm, savory, threaded with spice. Her stomach stirred softly, though she felt no hunger, only curiosity. The passage was shorter than the others, and soon it opened into a courtyard, alive with scent and warmth. This courtyard was smaller, more intimate, its walls closer, its shade deeper. Along the edges, clay ovens stood in alcoves, their surfaces warm and glowing faintly from coals hidden within. The air carried the fragrance of bread baking, herbs simmering, and citrus zest curling faintly into the breeze. At the center was a simple round fountain, its water steady and clear. Around it, low tables had been set, each draped with cloth embroidered in bright threads. Bowls and baskets covered the tables, their contents glowing with the colors of the earth. Figs split open to reveal ruby flesh, olives glistening in small clay dishes, loaves of bread with crusts golden from the oven. People moved gently through the courtyard, each one absorbed in the rhythm of preparing, sharing, tasting. Near the fountain, an older man sat with a wide wooden bowl on his lap. He kneaded dough slowly, his hands strong yet unhurried, folding and pressing, folding and pressing. Each movement was steady, almost meditative. From time to time he dusted the dough with flour, his palms leaving soft imprints behind. Beside one of the ovens, a young girl stood with her mother, watching as flat rounds of bread baked on the hot surface. The girl's eyes followed the way the dough bubbled, her lips parted in wonder when her mother flipped the bread, and the crust caught golden light. The girl clapped quietly, her delight bright but gentle, as though she knew this was a sacred moment. At one of the tables, a woman arranged bowls of herbs. She plucked mint leaves from their stems, crushed cumin seeds with a small stone, and scattered saffron threads into a dish of oil. Her movements were graceful, precise, carrying the rhythm of someone who had done this countless times. The scents rose like a song, filling the air with warmth and spice. Near the far wall, 2 boys sat cross-legged, their hands busy peeling oranges. They worked with quiet focus, setting each strip of peel neatly beside them. From time to time, they laughed softly when juice ran down their wrists, then licked it away, their joy bright but unassuming. Elena settled on a cushion near one of the low tables. A small clay cup of water had been placed there, its surface glinting with sunlight. She lifted it and drank slowly, the water cool and clear, carrying with it the faintest taste of earth and stone. Her gaze drifted as she sipped, her thoughts wandering gently. The man kneading dough, His patience stirred something in her. She thought of how bread carried more than nourishment, how it carried memory, tradition, the weight of hands that had done the same work for generations. The mother and daughter at the oven. Elena smiled softly. She thought of how joy could be found in something so simple, the turning of dough into bread, the magic of heat and time. The girl's eyes sparkled with wonder, and Elena felt her own heart echo it. The woman with the herbs, her movements were art. Elena thought of how flavors like colors or threads could be woven together, creating something greater than their parts. The saffron's golden glow seemed to carry the sun itself, the cumin its earth, the mint its breath of coolness. The boys with the oranges, their laughter was soft, like bubbles rising in water. Eleanor thought of how sweetness often came in small gifts, a slice of fruit, a moment of shared delight. She leaned back against the cushion, closing her eyes. The courtyard carried her gently, the crackle of ovens, the murmur of voices, the fragrance of herbs and bread. Each sound and scent blended into a rhythm that felt both ancient and new, grounding and light. Her mind wandered further. She thought of Granada, of the kitchens that must have once filled its houses, the laughter that rose from tables, the quiet devotion of hands preparing food. She thought of how culture was carried not only in stone and music, but in flavor, in the way bread rose, the way herbs were crushed, the way fruit was peeled and shared. When she opened her eyes again, she noticed another doorway. This one was low and arched, framed in brick, its surface plain but welcoming. A sprig of rosemary had been tucked above it, its scent sharp and fresh. Still, Elena lingered. The man placed his dough into a clay pan, covering it gently with a cloth before setting it aside to rise. The mother pulled a loaf from the oven, handing it carefully to her daughter, who cradled it in both hands, her eyes wide with pride. The woman with the herbs scattered mint across a dish, its green bright against the saffron's gold. The boys popped orange segments into their mouths, their smiles lighting the space as much as the sun above. Elena felt her chest warm. She thought of how nourishment was not only for the body but for the soul, how each act of preparing and sharing was its own form of love. This courtyard had given her that gift, the taste of generosity, of patience, of joy woven into food. At last, she rose. Her steps were soft across the tiles as she moved toward the rosemary-framed arch. She brushed her fingers lightly over the sprig, its scent sharp and grounding, and paused for a moment beneath it. She breathed in once more the mingled scents of bread, herbs, and citrus. Then with quiet certainty she stepped forward. The courtyard of flavors faded behind her. Chapter 12. The Courtyard of Shadows. The rosemary sprig brushed lightly against Elena's shoulder as she stepped through the low archway. The air in the passage was cooler, carrying a faint echo of voices that rose and fell like waves. She walked slowly, her sandals brushing over worn stone, until the corridor widened and light spilled through. When she emerged, she found herself in a courtyard where shadows danced. This space was broader, its high walls casting long ribbons of shade that cut across the tiled floor. The sun still entered but softened, broken by lattice screens and trailing vines. The patterns shifted gently as the breeze stirred, so that the whole courtyard seemed alive with moving light and shadow. At the center, a star-shaped fountain spilled water in thin streams from its many points, falling into a pool so shallow that the ripples reached its edges easily. The sound was delicate, like the hush of fabric being unfolded. Around the fountain, woven mats had been spread, their colors muted, their patterns geometric and steady. People gathered here in quiet clusters. Near the fountain, a man held a hand drum against his knee, tapping it lightly with his fingers. The rhythm was slow, steady, like a heartbeat stretched into calm. Across from him, another man answered with a frame drum, his palms moving with care, their sounds weaving into one another. The rhythm carried through the courtyard like a low, steady pulse. Beside them, a woman rose to her feet. She wore a long skirt of indigo fabric that shimmered faintly as she moved. Her arms lifted, her fingers tracing the air with slow precision. She stepped into the rhythm of the drums, not hurried, not fierce, but soft, as though she were dancing for the fountain itself. Each turn of her wrist, each sway of her skirt cast new shadows across the tiled floor. Others watched quietly. A young boy sat cross-legged, his chin resting in his hands, his eyes wide as he followed her movements. An older woman leaned against the wall, her face softened into a smile, as if she had seen such dances many times, yet still found wonder in them. Near one of the arches, a man tuned a small stringed instrument. When he plucked the first notes, they joined the rhythm of the drums, weaving melody into pulse. The sound rose like a thread of silver, lifting the dancer's movements, her steps responding gently to the song. Elena stood at the edge, watching. She felt the rhythm move through her chest, not as urgency, but as grounding, the way a heart beats softly when one is at rest. She moved to one of the mats near the fountain and sat, folding her dress neatly around her. The water's ripples touched the edges of the mat, cool against her fingers when she leaned forward to touch them. Her gaze wandered. The drummers, their patience moved her. They did not play to impress, but to hold a rhythm steady, as though creating a space in which others could breathe. The dancer, Eleanor thought of how shadows bent with her, how the courtyard itself seemed to move with her skirt. She imagined that dance was less about performance and more about prayer, a way of stitching the body to the world around it. The string player, his melody curved like a path, not straight, but winding, gentle, carrying both sorrow and sweetness in equal measure. The boy watching, his wonder was pure. Elena thought of how important it was that children see such things, to know that beauty could live in quiet gestures, in shadows, in rhythm. She leaned back slightly, closing her eyes. The sound of the drums blended with the trickle of the fountain, the notes of the stringed instrument weaving through both. The dancer's footsteps brushed softly against the tiles, the air shifting with her movement. All of it layered together, forming a rhythm that was more than music. It was presence itself. Her thoughts drifted. She imagined the countless nights this courtyard might have seen. Shadows from lanterns flickering, music rising softly, dancers moving slowly under the stars. She thought of how rhythm and movement connected people, binding them without words. It was not a performance, but a way of remembering, a way of being. When she opened her eyes again, the courtyard seemed to shimmer with a different light. The dancer's skirts swayed in slow arcs, the shadows shifting like rippling water. The boy still watched, his smile faint but unbroken. The drummer's hands never faltered, their rhythm steady as the earth itself. Near the far wall, half concealed by climbing ivy, a narrow doorway stood. Its arch was simple, its frame shaded, as though waiting quietly for her. Above it, a lantern of pierced metal hung unlit, its patterns casting faint designs across the stone. Still, Elena lingered. The string player let his final notes fade, his fingers resting gently on the strings. The dancer lowered her arms slowly, bowing her head before returning to her place on the mat. The drummers tapped one last time, their rhythm ending with a softness that blended seamlessly into the fountain's trickle. For a moment the courtyard held only silence, rich and full. Elena felt her chest rise and fall with ease. She thought of how rhythm had carried her, how shadows had moved with her. This courtyard had given her the gift of stillness made visible, sound made into breath. At last she rose. Her sandals brushed softly against the mats as she crossed toward the ivy-framed doorway. She reached up, her fingers brushing the cool metal of the lantern above, feeling the carved patterns beneath her touch. She breathed in once more the mingled scents of ivy, dust, and warm stone. Then with a gentle certainty she stepped forward. The courtyard of shadows faded behind her. Chapter 13. The Courtyard of Voices. The ivy-framed doorway closed behind Eleanor with a faint rustle, the metal lantern above it swaying slightly in the breeze. The passage she entered was narrower than before, its walls painted in faded plaster, once bright with color but now softened with age. The air smelled faintly of ink and parchment, threaded with the sweetness of dried figs. She walked slowly, her sandals brushing lightly against stone worn smooth by centuries. Ahead, she heard not music this time, but voices, low, steady, rising and falling like the rhythm of waves on a shore. It was not chatter nor argument, but something gentler, as though each voice carried its own measure of care. The passage opened into a courtyard bathed in warm afternoon light. This one was lined with shelves. The walls were covered in wooden niches, each filled with scrolls, bound books, and loose sheets of parchment tied neatly with cord. Some were new, their surfaces bright and smooth, while others were worn and yellowed, their edges curled with time. A faint breeze stirred the pages, carrying with it a whisper, as though the words themselves were speaking softly into the air. At the center stood a circular fountain, low and shallow, its surface still except for the quiet trickle of water from a single spout. The water reflected the shelves around it, so that the courtyard seemed wrapped in words, held within language itself. People were gathered in small groups, their voices weaving into the courtyard's rhythm. Near the fountain, an elderly man sat cross-legged, a book open across his lap. Children clustered around him, their faces lifted, their eyes wide. His voice was soft but firm, carrying the cadence of someone who had told stories for many years. The children leaned closer as he read, their expressions shifting with every phrase. Sometimes smiling, sometimes thoughtful, sometimes quiet as if holding their breath. Not far away, a woman in a pale scarf copied lines from a parchment onto fresh paper. Her quill scratched gently, steady as a heartbeat. From time to time she paused to blow lightly across the ink, her breath fanning it dry before continuing. At a long wooden table beneath an arch, two young men debated softly over a single book spread between them. Their gestures were small, their voices calm, each one listening carefully before replying. Their words rose and fell with patience, carrying not the sharpness of argument, but the warmth of discovery. In the shade of a fig tree, a girl no older than 15 practiced reciting lines of poetry. Her lips moved, her voice low and melodic, each phrase rising like a small bird before falling gently back into silence. Beside her, a woman who might have been her teacher listened with her eyes half closed, nodding with approval each time the girl's voice found its rhythm. Elena moved softly to a bench near the fountain and sat, her dress folding neatly around her. She rested her palms on the warm stone, feeling the hum of voices through her fingertips. Her gaze drifted, the storyteller with the children. His voice carried more than words. It carried memory, the kind that settled into the heart. Elena thought of how stories stitched people together, how they lingered long after pages closed. The woman with her quill. Elena imagined the devotion in her copying, each letter shaped with care, not just to preserve meaning, but to honor it. She thought of how patience was a kind of love, given word by word. The young men in debate, their calmness touched her. They did not argue to win, but to learn, each one listening as carefully as they spoke. She thought of how rare such listening was, how it softened the air around them. The girl reciting poetry. Eleanor smiled faintly. The words might not yet be perfect, but they were alive. She thought of how poetry was less about precision and more about presence, about giving breath to words so they could find their place in the world. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of parchment and figs. Around her, the courtyard hummed softly with voices, each one a thread in a larger tapestry. She felt herself woven into it, her breath blending with theirs, her silence part of the whole. Her thoughts drifted to Granada again, to how words must have passed through this city like rivers, carried in many tongues, shaping lives and memories. She thought of how language was its own kind of architecture, building spaces where people could meet and rest together. When she opened her eyes, the light had shifted slightly, softening as the sun lowered toward evening. Shadows stretched across the shelves, the pages catching faint glimmers of gold. Her gaze wandered to the far end of the courtyard. There, half hidden behind a curtain of woven reeds, stood another doorway. Its frame was plain, but above it hung a small wooden plaque, carved with lines of poetry. She could not read them from where she sat, but their presence stirred her curiosity. Still, she lingered. The storyteller closed his book gently, the children sighing as though reluctant to leave the world he had opened. The woman with the quill placed her parchment aside, her fingers brushing the fresh ink as though blessing it. The young men leaned closer to one another, their debate softening into laughter. The girl beneath the fig tree finished her recitation, her teacher's hand resting lightly on her shoulder in quiet praise. Elena's chest warmed. She thought of how voices were like water, carrying, soothing, shaping. This courtyard had given her the gift of listening, of remembering that words spoken gently could heal as surely as silence. At last she rose. Her steps were slow, unhurried, as she walked toward the reed curtain. She brushed her hand lightly across its woven strands, feeling their roughness beneath her palm. She paused beneath the wooden plaque, lifting her eyes to its carved lines. Though she could not read them fully, she felt their weight, their truth lingering in the air. She breathed in once more the mingled scents of ink, parchment, and figs. Then, with quiet certainty, she stepped forward. The courtyard of voices faded behind her. Chapter 18. The Courtyard of Rest. The knotted fabric above the doorway stirred against Eleanor's shoulder as she stepped through, its fibers rough but grounding beneath her touch. The passage she entered was wide, its walls washed in soft earth tones. The lamps here burned lower, their flames steady but dimmer, as though guiding her gently rather than lighting her way. The air was cool, touched with the faint fragrance of lavender. Her sandals moved quietly across the stone. She could already sense the next courtyard before she reached it, not through sound or light, but through the feeling of stillness that seemed to drift toward her like mist. When she emerged, her breath slowed at once. This courtyard was quieter than all the rest. Its walls rose high but were bare, painted in soft ivory that reflected the glow of lanterns placed evenly around the space. The lanterns were covered with pale fabric shades, so their light was diffused, spreading gently across the tiles in pools of warmth. The air itself seemed to glow, not brightly, but tenderly, like dusk holding onto the last of the sun. At the center was a large, rectangular pool, wider than any she had seen. The water was perfectly still, its surface unbroken, reflecting both lanterns and sky. Stars shimmered faintly in its depth, mingling with lantern light so seamlessly that it was hard to tell where earth ended and heaven began. Here, the people were few and their movements slow. Near the pool, a woman sat with her head bent, braiding long strands of grass. Her fingers moved steadily, weaving the strands into a mat. Each braid was slow, deliberate, her face calm as though the task itself was a form of meditation. Beside her, a man reclined on a low cushion, his eyes closed, his breath deep and even. His hands rested loosely on his chest, his face softened by stillness. From time to time, his lips curved faintly, as though he were drifting through dreams too light to disturb. At the far end of the courtyard, beneath an arch, two children lay curled side by side, wrapped in a blanket. Their shoulders rose and fell with steady breaths, their hands still faintly clutching each other's. A woman, perhaps their mother, sat nearby humming softly, her eyes on them, her voice low and steady. By one of the lanterns, an old man polished a clay cup with a cloth, his movements unhurried. He lifted the cup often to the light, studying it, not searching for flaw, but for the way it glowed faintly in the lantern's glow. His hands were steady, his eyes quiet, his devotion carrying the weight of patience. Eleanor walked softly to the edge of the pool and sat, her hands folded in her lap. She leaned forward slightly, gazing into the water. The reflection was so clear it was almost disorienting. Lanterns above and lanterns below, stars mirrored twice, herself seated between them. She trailed one hand into the pool, and ripples spread outward, breaking the stillness before folding gently back again. Her gaze drifted, the woman with her braids. Elena thought of how rest sometimes came through small repetition, through giving the hands a rhythm while the heart softened into silence. The man reclining. She thought of how stillness itself was a gift, how sometimes the most profound act was simply to let the body be. The children, their sleep touched her. She thought of how innocence was its own form of peace, how rest could be carried in something as simple as trust, as closeness. The man with the cup. Elena thought of how patience could polish life itself, how sometimes the smallest gestures, the smoothing of clay, the turning of it toward light, could carry meaning deeper than words. She leaned back, closing her eyes. The air was cool, scented with lavender, the only sounds the faint hum of the mother's song and the steady breath of those at rest. She let it settle into her chest, her own breath slowing to match. Her thoughts wandered. She thought of her journey, the courtyards she had walked through, the people she had seen. Each had given her something: joy, patience, memory, rhythm, color, silence, song. Now, this one gave her rest. She thought of how necessary it was to pause, to breathe, to let everything settle before moving onward. When she opened her eyes, the stars above had grown brighter, mirrored in the pool, until it seemed as though the courtyard itself floated in the sky. The lanterns glowed softly, their fabric shades glowing like moons lowered close to the earth. On the far wall she noticed another doorway. Its arch was wide, framed with pale stone, but no lantern hung above it. Instead, a small bowl of water rested at its base, its surface still and reflecting the faintest shimmer of stars. The doorway felt different, not an invitation to another courtyard, but a passage towards something final, something waiting quietly. Still, Elena lingered. The woman set aside her finished braid and smoothed it gently against the floor. The man on the cushion shifted slightly, his lips curving again before settling back into stillness. The children's breaths deepened, their blanket rising and falling gently, their mother's humming steady and low. The old man held his cup close to his face, studying its faint glow with eyes softened by time. Elena felt her heart ease. This courtyard had given her the gift of rest, of stillness that prepared her to step onward. She thought of how every journey needed pauses, how every step forward carried more weight when taken after a breath. At last she rose. Her sandals brushed lightly against the tiles as she moved toward the wide arch. She paused at the small bowl of water, dipping her fingers into its cool surface. She touched her forehead lightly, then let the drops fall back, the water rippling gently before stilling once more. She breathed in once more the mingled scents of lavender, clay, and lantern smoke. Then with quiet certainty, she stepped forward. The courtyard of rest faded behind her. Chapter 19. The Courtyard of Return. The wide arch behind her hushed itself as Elena stepped through, the faint ripple of water from the bowl at its base still cooling her fingertips. The passage she entered was unlike the others, broader, smoother, its walls polished as though shaped by countless hands. Small alcoves glowed faintly with oil lamps, their light steady and golden, guiding her onward like stars set into stone. The air carried a different weight here. It was not heavier, but fuller, as though all the courtyards she had passed through had gathered together, pressing gently around her, carrying her forward. She walked slowly, her steps soft until the passage opened. And then she was there. This courtyard was the largest of all. Its walls rose high, but instead of being plain or painted, they were open in places, carved with arches that let the night sky pour in. Beyond, the stars spread wide, more brilliant than she had ever seen them, as though the heavens themselves had drawn closer. At the center was not a fountain this time, nor a pool, but a wide circle of grass, soft and green. The grass was cool beneath the evening air, scattered with white blossoms that glowed faintly in lantern light. Around the circle, lanterns hung high, their glass clear, their flames steady. Their glow mingled with starlight so seamlessly that it was hard to know which belonged to earth and which to sky. People were here, but fewer than in the other courtyards. They moved slowly, their voices low, their gestures calm. Some sat upon the grass, their hands resting in their laps, their eyes lifted to the stars. Others reclined against the walls, their shoulders relaxed, their faces softened. Near the center, a young boy lay on his back, pointing upward, his finger tracing constellations he could not name. Beside him, his grandmother leaned close, listening as if he were teaching her something new. The boy's voice was hushed, but his wonder was radiant, and her smile shone faintly in its reflection. On the far side, a woman spread a shawl across the grass, its fabric embroidered with golden thread. She smoothed it carefully, then lay upon it, her arms folded beneath her head, her gaze lost to the sky. A man settled beside her, their hands brushing lightly, their silence a shared language. Near one of the arches, an elder sat with a small group of listeners. He spoke in a low voice, not telling a story this time, but sharing fragments of memory. The smell of orange blossoms in spring, the sound of swallows at dusk, the way the tiles glowed after rain. His words were not grand, but they settled over the group like a blanket, each one carrying warmth. Elena walked softly to the edge of the grass and lowered herself onto it. The blades bent cool beneath her, the blossoms brushing lightly against her hands. She leaned back slowly until she was lying down, her eyes lifted to the sky. The stars shimmered above her, mirrored in her memory by the fountains, the pools, the lanterns she had passed. Each courtyard seemed to gather here, their gifts folding into one another: rhythm, silence, color, song, memory, rest. She felt them settle into her chest, not as weight, but as light, each one a lantern lit within her. Her gaze drifted to the boy and his grandmother. She thought of how wonder passed so easily from one generation to another, carried not through instruction, but through presence. She thought of how the stars themselves had been watched for centuries, guiding, comforting, reminding. Her eyes shifted to the woman with her shawl. She thought of how beauty did not need words, how sometimes it was enough to simply rest beside another, sharing the vastness of the sky. Her thoughts turned to the elder speaking beneath the arch. She thought of how memory was not only carried in objects, but in the small details: a blossom, a bird, a tile warmed by sun. She thought of how lives were built, not only of grand stories, but of these small, tender fragments. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in deeply. The air was cool now, threaded with the scent of jasmine and night-blooming flowers. The grass beneath her was soft, grounding. Around her the courtyard hummed with stillness, its rhythm not in movement but in breath. Her mind drifted, gathering the courtyards she had walked. She remembered the boy with his wooden boat, the old men laughing on the bench, the women embroidering, the child balancing on the fountain's edge. She remembered the lantern makers, the musicians, the storytellers, the spinners of wool. She remembered colors, shadows, and song. She remembered the way each courtyard had invited her not to hurry, not to strive, but to rest in what was given. She felt her chest ease. She felt as though she had been gathered, stitched together by each gift, carried here to this place where all the threads met. When she opened her eyes again, the stars seemed brighter, their light trembling in the air. The boys' laughter carried faintly across the courtyard. The elder's voice faded into silence. The woman's shawl glowed faintly in the lantern light. And then Eleanor understood. This courtyard was not meant to lead her onward. It was the end, or perhaps the beginning. It was not a place of passing, but a place of return, a place where the courtyards within her could rest, whole and unbroken. She rose slowly, standing at the center of the grass. The lanterns glowed around her, the stars above her, the blossoms beneath her feet. She breathed in deeply, letting the night fill her chest, her body, her very being. She turned once in a slow circle, her eyes traveling across the courtyard, taking it in as though it were the final page of a book, the last note of a song. She felt gratitude swell in her, not for one thing alone, but for everything, for every step that had brought her here. At last, she lowered herself back to the grass and lay down again. The sky opened above her, vast and endless. Her breath slowed. Her body softened. The lanterns flickered. The stars trembled. The air grew still, and Elena rested. The courtyards of Granada had carried her home.